Imagine a group armed and organized, operating in a territory fraught with conflict. Is this group a terrorist organization or a military force? Today we're exploring the nature of Hamas, a Palestinian political organization with an armed wing, which operates in the contentious region of Gaza. Their actions and motivations have stirred worldwide debates. The provocative question we pose today: is Hamas a terrorist group, spreading fear and chaos? Or are they a military force, tasked with protecting the civilians of Gaza? Now let's delve into the two contrasting perspectives on Hamas. First, we explore the view of Hamas as a terrorist group. To understand why Hamas is labeled a terrorist entity by some, we need to dive into the historical waters that have shaped its identity. Formed in the late 1980s, Hamas quickly gained notoriety for its use of suicide bombing attacks against Israeli targets. These acts of violence, aimed at creating a state of terror and fear, are one of the primary reasons why certain governments and organizations, such as the United States and the European Union, categorize Hamas as a terrorist group. The strategies employed by Hamas also contribute to this perception. Unlike conventional armed forces, Hamas operates in a manner that blurs the lines between civilian and military targets. Their fighters sometimes operate from populated areas, using civilians as a shield of sorts, a tactic that is generally frowned upon in international law. This strategy, coupled with their use of indiscriminate rocket attacks, adds to the narrative of Hamas as a terrorist entity. But it's not just the methods employed by Hamas that earn them this label, it's also their stated goals. Hamas's charter, first published in 1988, calls for the destruction of the State of Israel. This objective, seen as a threat to international peace and stability, firmly cements the perception of Hamas as a terrorist group in the eyes of many. However, it's important to note that these are not universally accepted views. To some, particularly within the Palestinian territories, Hamas is seen as a resistance movement, fighting against what they perceive as Israeli occupation. This dichotomy underscores the complexity of the situation in the Middle East and the challenge of finding a path towards peace. That's a glimpse into why some perceive Hamas as a terrorist group. Now let's consider the perspective that sees Hamas as a military force. The world is not black and white, and neither is the view of Hamas. There are those who see the group as a military force, a necessity born out of a need for protection and defense. They argue that the actions of Hamas are not rooted in terror but in retaliation, a response to occupation and aggression. To these observers, Hamas is not a villainous entity, but a group of people who have taken up arms in defense of their land and their people. They see Hamas as the only viable option for Palestinians in Gaza, who are caught in the crossfire of a decades-long conflict. They believe that without the protection of a military force, the civilians of Gaza would be left defenseless against attacks. This perspective views the actions of Hamas as a desperate bid for survival and liberation. They see rockets being launched not as acts of terror, but as the only means of asserting sovereignty and fighting back against a powerful adversary. They argue that under international law, people have the right to resist occupation, and that is what they believe Hamas is doing. They point to the fact that the group was democratically elected in 2006 as evidence of its legitimacy. They argue that Hamas represents the will of the people of Gaza, who have chosen them as their defenders in a time of crisis. This view does not condone violence or excuse the loss of innocent lives. Instead, it seeks to understand the actions of Hamas within the context of a complex, protracted conflict. It suggests that the group's military actions are a response to a situation that has left them with few other options. That provides insight into why others perceive Hamas as a military force. So, we've observed two contrasting views on Hamas. On one hand, some see it as a terrorist group, citing acts of violence and disruption. On the other, there's the perspective of Hamas as a military force, tasked with protecting Gaza's civilians. This debate isn't simple. It's steeped in political, cultural, and personal beliefs that greatly influence how one perceives Hamas. The question remains, is Hamas a terrorist group or a military force? Perhaps the answer isn't as binary as we might think.